Good morning to viewers in the UK, and good afternoon and good evening to our viewers from around the world. Welcome to another In Conversation, Encounters Across Faith and Thought with myself, where we explore the meeting points and sometimes the meaningful differences between faith, philosophy, ethics, and public life. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Alejandro Sanchez. Alejandro is a human rights lead at the National Secular Society, an organization campaigning for a society in which people of all beliefs and none can live together safely and freely as equal citizens. Before joining the National Secular Society, he worked as a medical doctor within the NHS and also holds a master's degree in medical ethics and law from King's College London. His work has particularly focused on children's rights, medical ethics, religious freedom, and the law surrounding male circumcision. His advocacy has been featured in publications including The Guardian, The Sunday Times, the BMJ, the Community Care, The Mirror, and UnHerd. Alejandro, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you, and you're surrounded by a glow of menorah as well, which is quite amazing.
Thank you so much for, hello everyone. Thank you so much for the generous invitation to come on, Paul. Very excited to discuss this topic with you.
Amazing. Well, rather than diving straight into issues that some people might regard as more controversial.
Right.
Let's help listeners understand you first and the organization that you represent. I mean, you initially trained as a doctor. So, I mean, what drew you into medicine, public policy, and human rights in the first place?
Yeah, well, I was always interested in science at school. My parents were very encouraging of me to pursue a career in medicine. So I went up to med school in Newcastle and graduated there and did a few years in the NHS before fairly quickly realizing that clinical life and my sanity were mutually exclusive. And then via a very circuitous route, via Shanghai and Hong Kong, I ended up back in London during COVID and found myself at something of a loose end. And I was sort of toying with the idea of returning to medicine, but I felt I couldn't really do it to myself. But I asked what were the parts of medicine that I always enjoyed most, and it was the medical ethics and legal aspects of it. So I ended up doing this MA at King's, and our modules were on things like assisted dying, reproductive rights, and the ethics and legality of different forms of non-therapeutic genital cutting. And so when I completed the MA, I was looking for jobs, and these are all areas that the National Secular Society happens to campaign on. So it felt like a very happy fit. But I wonder, would it be useful to sort of explain to your listeners what we conceive of when we speak of secularism?
Yeah, I do think so, because especially amongst some Muslim communities, they hear all sorts of things, and they don't necessarily have the same definition that you would have or your organization. So it's very useful to understand how you define that and what you mean by it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, secularism is a political principle rather than a religious belief. So just to be very explicit, it's not atheism. It's the political principle that the state should be neutral on matters of religion. So any given religious belief should not be privileged in public life, and nor should it be disadvantaged. So you can be, at least as we see it, both religious and a secularist. And there are some prominent Muslims who describe themselves as secularists, like Baroness Faulkner, for example, who's the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So we believe everybody has the right to believe as they see fit. We campaign to protect that right, and we think everybody should be allowed to manifest those beliefs right up to the point that it starts to infringe upon the rights and freedoms of others. And so that does mean challenging what we see as religious privilege when we see it. So currently, we have a constitutional arrangement, for example, that doesn't reflect the sort of increasingly religiously diverse and irreligious UK. So we have 26 Church of England bishops, for example, who sit by right. So they have automatic seats in the House of Lords where they can debate and vote on laws that affect everyone in this country. And we're very welcoming of religious representatives participating in political life, but we think it should be on the basis of equality rather than preferential treatment of reserved seats, for
It's
example.
quite a strange one, that, isn't it? I mean, according to the latest or the most up-to-date census figures that we have,
Yeah,
the Church of England represents something like about 15% of belief among the population of England.
right.
Um,
And I think it's
and
less than
it's
2% of the population are sort of regularly attending C of
there's
E
there's that as
services.
well. I'm being generous and going by the
Yeah,
people who actually affiliate, because not everybody goes to church or
yeah,
mosque or synagogue or gurdwara or whatever, do they? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't hold those beliefs.
yeah.
And I understand that, but it does seem a bit odd
It
that
is a bit
when they are
odd.
representing 15% of the population by faith,
Yeah,
that they are the only people that have guaranteed religious representation in the House of Lords.
yeah,
And I mean, I'm not saying this any knock towards the Church of England or anything negative towards them as an organisation. I mean, but it does seem a tad unfair. Um,
absolutely. And I mean, the only other group which was entitled to automatic seats were the hereditary peers.
mm.
And we've just passed legislation to remove those automatic entitlements. So it really is now only the bishops who enjoy this privileged position in our legislature. And yeah, it is odd in an international context as well. I think it's only Iran is the only other country that has guaranteed seats for clerics in the legislature.
That's I'm not sure that's necessarily the company that we want to be keeping on
Yeah,
the
I mean,
international
I'm not
scene.
comparing C of E bishops to the mullahs, but
I know, but it's
we're unusual
yeah,
bedfellows.
it's kind of embarrassing actually when you think about it. It's yeah. Um, no, so
Um,
so I mean, do you have a belief yourself?
I well, I was raised Catholic actually, so I would go to mass every Sunday. Um, I did my communion. I had religious confession with our local priest. But then I reached my teenage years and discovered Dawkins and Hitchens, and sadly that was that for my faith. If I ever believed, which I'm not sure that I did. Um, yeah, so I suppose in my teenage years, I was probably one of these fairly insufferable, militant atheists. But no, I think now secularism sort of appeals to me more. Not that it's a religious position, but compared to an explicit advocacy of atheism, I think it makes room for people of all religions and none to share a common
You're basically
political
more
worldview.
open-minded now, and you,
Yeah,
you weigh things up. Yeah, I guess whatever path we go into, um, we all have that to a degree. I mean, it's like I embraced Islam 26 years ago,
right,
and I went through about 6 months or so when I was so happy with what I discovered, and it was no everybody saw it,
right,
and it's like, and eventually you calm down a little bit, and you start to weigh things up. And the more that I've learned within my religious tradition, the more it's grounded me, and
hmm
actually, it's some people might find it surprising, but it's made me more liberal and open-minded in my views as I read up on what scholars over the centuries have believed and how they understood things, how they weighed things up.
great.
So I think I guess not everybody goes down that path of maturing and balancing, but it's a lot of people do, and it's natural course where we're supposed to as we grow. Um,
Hopefully.
and the more we learn, we're supposed to realize that there's a lot we don't know, and no matter how much we learn, whatever we know is like a drop in the ocean. And that's not to undervalue what we know, but it is. it should give us a little bit of humility in being able to engage with people, which is why I've invited you onto my show, because I think it's important that although we may disagree on certain things, um, but people have the opportunity to hear both perspectives and weigh up the arguments for themselves and
Absolutely.
make up their own minds, because we're in a very dangerous situation when people are stuck within echo chambers,
For
and
sure.
they don't hear the other perspectives, and there's validity to all manner of different perspectives on many things. It's that there's often not an easy answer, or there might be certain principles which everybody can agree upon, but the actual solution, is harder to define, and there may be various different approaches which are valid, and we can't arrive at that unless we discuss the spectrum of ideas and thoughts on any particular issue, and that's how civilizations grow. So, I
Absolutely.
mean,
I'm
I see your organization is obviously promoting this kind of approach, which is very positive.
Yeah, no, we campaign for free speech and open conversation, and as you say, the only way societies can make progress is through these means, unless you want to resort to violence, which nobody would advocate.
Well, some people do, unfortunately, and that's the danger as well, when you completely shut down any particular narrative and you don't engage with the issues. I mean, if it is a foolish narrative, if it is something which is dangerous, and then have that conversation in public, and expose it.
Yeah,
If,
dismantle
if
it.
you if you shut it down and say, "Oh, no one can talk about it," then what tends to happen is it goes underground,
Yeah,
and like some of these very far right Nazi type ideologies, they're not discussed in public. Well, they should, in a way. They should be discussed and they should be exposed as the dangerous ideas that they are, and for people to understand why that is. And that happens through having conversations about them,
absolutely.
not promoting those views, but having the conversations and challenging those ideas.
Yeah,
Because if we don't, people forget why they were ever frowned upon in the first place, and they take root in dark places and underground and in internet chat rooms that and before long you end up with a huge following behind some crazy idea that doesn't make sense. And conspiracy theories are another one as well, which
mm,
is quite concerning. People believing that the earth, literally believing the earth is flat,
right.
in 2026, and that Artemis never went to the moon and it's all CGI and AI effects when the whole thing was live streamed. I mean, this is crazy.
Yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree with your philosophy on this.
Mm. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to listen.
Violently agreeing.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Um, so, was there a defining moment when you realized like these issues around like children's rights and medical ethics related to them and stuff deserved your full attention?
Yeah, I suppose during my MA, a colleague, a forensic psychiatrist who I befriended, shared a paper, an academic paper with me
Mm.
by an academic called Brian Earp, who's written extensively on, yeah, how specifically non-therapeutic male circumcision, but also other forms of non-therapeutic genital cutting engage the rights of children, and how there are some interesting parallels between these different practices, and yet we take seemingly very different ethical and legal approaches to dealing with them.
What would you so do you want to outline the issues and the concerns around them for our viewers to get an
Yeah,
idea of, you know?
absolutely. So maybe we can stick to the UK context to start with, at least.
Mm.
And I think it's useful to frame questions around male circumcision, probably with two questions. So, first of all, if they are to be performed on, a non-consenting child, how can we make sure they are done as safely as possible? And then secondly, and more fundamentally, is this a decision that can wait, that can be deferred until the individual is old enough to decide for himself based on his own values? So if we start with that first question, so currently the legal arrangement in this country is endangering the lives of children. I think that is undeniable at this point. So just to lay out for your listeners, um, anyone in the UK can legally circumcise a boy. So according to the government, they don't require medical training. They don't even have to have proven expertise. They don't have to use anesthesia. They can be a doctor who has been struck off the medical register for dangerous and cruel circumcisions and perfectly legally continue to circumcise boys as a layperson. There isn't even a minimum age limit to become a circumciser. And we've long argued that this is
These
endangering the.
these points that you've raised, I mean, when you first highlighted these to me, I think it was a few months ago,
Yeah,
I was shocked. I was actually
yeah,
horrified because I always assumed that, like it would actually be you go to a doctor, you get someone who's qualified to do this medical procedure. Because even if it's, for religious reasons, it's still a medical procedure, and
absolutely.
you want it done in a professional way. I mean, obviously, I think vast majority of parents, whether they are Jewish, Muslim, or others, there are also some others who do this circumcision. Um, most parents care about their children, and they wouldn't
Of
want
course, yeah,
anything bad to happen to their child. So, of course, you'd want the best person to do this. Um, and the fact that anyone can literally do it, uh, even people who are struck off the medical register.
yeah.
I mean, that surely should be criminal. It's quite shocking that that's allowed, and there's nothing, criminal in that. That just I was gobsmacked.
Yeah. I mean, so last year there were two criminal convictions of circumcisers whose circumcisions were so badly and negligently performed that they did end up being jailed. So in the
Well, this is
first,
the thing. When I googled it and I
yeah,
looked up and realized that there were these cases. I mean,
yeah,
I was horrified. I
yeah.
mean, no.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I could just talk you through one of them briefly. So in last January, Mohammed Siddiqui was jailed for 5 years for crimes against boys, including child cruelty and actual bodily harm. And so he was one of these doctors who had been struck off for dangerous and cruel circumcisions. And he could legally continue to circumcise boys. But then, because those circumcisions were again so badly performed, I mean, someone who should have been subjected to, additional scrutiny, having been struck off the medical register, was
Yeah,
in fact subjected to less as a layperson. And yeah, his circumcisions left boys' penises, exploding with blood, black, necrotic, foul-smelling, requiring surgical follow-up, over a decade later. Um, and
doesn't
one
bear
of
to
his,
think. It's horrible. Horrible.
yeah,
No.
and in some of those circumcisions, he used no anesthesia whatsoever, and he was convicted of child cruelty on that basis. But I guess what's really curious, I suppose, is that there are also registered charities which train circumcisers. So these are charities that, are subsidized by the taxpayer. So, they don't have to pay income tax. And they very openly say on their website that, most of the time anesthesia is not used. And this is despite the Royal College of Anaesthetists telling us last year that circumcision is a painful procedure, that they think as a minimum local anesthesia needs to be used. And this idea that, babies don't experience pain is erroneous. So, I mean, yeah, just off the back of those two criminal convictions last year, we've now had the judges in their sentencing remarks. They both called for the law to be reformed. So, in the Siddiqui case, the judge said that safeguards and protections must be introduced as a matter of urgency, and he underlined it in his sentencing remarks. And then so that joins the call of two coroners now who have sent prevention of future deaths reports to the government saying the current legal arrangement is endangering children and you must act to do something to protect children. So that the first one of those was back in 2015, and the coroner wrote to the then conservative government, and the government said, we would encourage parents to only have this performed by a regulated healthcare professional, but
Yeah.
uh, changing the law would require too much would require extensive consultation. So we're not going to do it. And I really do think that is a dereliction of duty. And it was entirely foreseeable that more children would die. And sadly, that's exactly what happened.
It makes you
Um,
wonder what they need the extensive consultation for when it seems like a very simple thing just to put in place that it has to be performed by a, a medical professional who has a license.
you would think,
I mean,
but
it's like they no, that's not saying people can't be circumcised.
right,
Just make sure that the person you get to do the job is actually qualified to do the job and has a license to do it.
yeah.
I mean, why would that require? I mean, it's very bizarre.
It is bizarre. I think whenever you ask the government about this, the religious sensitivities are always what they highlight in
Mm.
justifying their inaction. And I think they are,
But I'm Muslim. I wouldn't want this banned because I know
right,
how important it is to a lot of people. But at the same
yeah,
time, it should be absolute minimum that this is performed by medical professionals and not just by anybody. I mean, from what you told me, anybody, even a person, there's no minimum age. How
there's no minimum
ridiculous is
age.
that?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I suppose so. I guess
and
they're like,
also the other thing is, I mean, as with any kind of, I mean, it involves removing, it involves
yeah,
removing skin from
tissue.
the body,
Yeah,
tissue.
yeah,
It's like any procedure that involves cutting or removing tissue,
yeah,
there is the potential for things to go wrong, even if they
absolutely,
are done by a medical professional. So you
absolutely.
want someone there who can act immediately and knows how to deal with that so that the complications don't become something severe and can be easily resolved, which they can be if they're done by someone who knows what they're doing. But of course, if they're done by someone who doesn't,
Yeah.
as you said, the horrific things that you discussed on the previous case that you highlighted, these
Mm.
things can happen because the person doesn't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we've had five baby boys have died since 2007 following non-therapeutic
It's
circumcision.
unconscionable.
But yeah, I mean, as you say, those have been performed by a variety of practitioners. So in one case, that was performed at a GP surgery. In another, it was a home circumcision performed by a nurse. And then we had two deaths where the circumcision was performed by a rabbi. And then most recently, in the death of Muhammad Abdizamad, that was performed by an Islamic circumciser who had no medical training and not even a basic first aid certificate.
Mm. Not even a basic first aid certificate. I mean, are you
Yeah,
kidding me?
yeah. So, and yeah, and I think,
Mm.
as you said, like parents would be really surprised that anyone would be allowed to do this without medical expertise, without medical training. And one of the parents in the Siddiqui case, in that criminal conviction last year, they said they were shocked to learn this. They said, this risks endangering the lives of children, and that they thought that this uh, gap in the legislation, I think is the words they use, needed to be addressed. But in terms of what the roadblocks are to introducing, even regulation, um, well, I suppose like if you are a charity that is training circumcisers and you know those circumcisions don't use anesthesia, that would surely fall outside of a regulatory regime, right? Which would require properly, rightly so, anesthesia to be used. Um, so
It's
yeah,
a
I think
strange charity, that as well.
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, do they, the people that they train, do you know, that they get people who are actually doctors and train them? Or, but then at the end, would a doctor need that? They'd surely get trained to do that as
Um,
a
so
doctor.
within the Jewish community, there are two of these sort of voluntary regulatory bodies. So on the more sort of liberal wing of progressive Judaism, there's the Association of Liberal and Reform Mochilim, so ritual circumcisers, and they already require their circumcisers to be medically trained and to use anesthesia. So there's clearly already a precedent for these requirements, although these are voluntary
Well,
in these
we are
cases.
living in 2026. We're not
Yeah,
living hundreds of years ago. I mean, you
yeah.
would think so.
But then the Initiation Society, which is this registered charity that I've told you about, so they don't require their circumcisers to be doctors. And if you go on their website and look at the FAQ, it will say that anesthesia is generally not used during the bris, which is the ritual circumcision on the 8th day in the Jewish tradition.
That is quite shocking.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
And
yeah,
we're the only people who are flagging this up.
well, we're not. So there's another so there's a charity up in Staffordshire called 15 Square, which supports men who are having to decide whether for medical or non-medical reasons whether they wish to be circumcised, and also supporting men who have been harmed by this practice. So they are speaking out as well. And then, well, we've had, two judges, two coroners, and actually religious groups themselves. So in response to, in January, I believe, the Muslim Council of Britain said that, safeguards should be urgently introduced. Rabbi Jonathan Romain, who you may know, yeah, he's called for unqualified individuals practicing circumcision to be criminalized. Um, and he's also spoken out about a particular form of circumcision within the Jewish community called metzitza b'peh, which I don't know if you've heard of, but it's when the circumciser sucks the circumcision wound after it's been performed. And
I've heard of it. It's
yeah, and it can lead to the child contracting herpes, which can lead to brain damage and or death. So there have been recent deaths in New York following this practice, and there was a recent case in Israel where a child was hospitalized with herpes. So this is extremely serious, and
of course, yeah. I mean, it's
I
one of
think,
those things that you can see, goes back probably, I was going to say centuries, probably goes back a few millennium,
yeah,
and it's just carried on. But, we now know better. We have medical knowledge these days that people didn't have access to in the past.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It was largely
although it sounds
abandoned.
incredibly bizarre to us, maybe at one time that did make sense several millennia ago, but in 2026 it certainly doesn't. It's and as you say, it leads to the risk of disease, which
Yeah,
is it's just um, it's not a very nice thought anyway. It's like it's
no.
a horrible thing to consider,
Um,
but it's this is the problem. When people get taught certain things that date back millennia,
yeah,
and it's not revised, in light of modern times. I mean, this is something which we're supposed to be improving things. We're not supposed to be. I mean, even within our books, within both Islam and within Judaism, there is the concept that we're supposed to be doing things in the best way, and we're supposed to be improving. We're not supposed to be going backwards and
yeah,
adopting things that don't make sense. I mean, even the Quran highlights, do you just do like what your forefathers did without thinking about it?
right,
It's a clear message in the Quran. We're supposed to think about it and make sure that we're doing things in the best possible way.
yeah,
Um, and that's actually an obligation upon us as Muslims.
right, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, so just to sort of sum up, like there's calls from the judiciary, coroners, religious groups, secularist groups,
Mm.
families of victims, all saying that, if this is to be done, it needs to be done safely. So it really is time for the government to act to protect children. But then perhaps we can move on to the second question in our broader framing, which is whether this is a decision that
Yeah,
can wait until the
the
individual can.
age, I mean, and of course, I mean, this is something which I know from within my own faith community. It is debated among scholars
Right.
whether, children should be a certain age before they can make the decision, or whether they should even be adults before they make the decision. It's
Okay.
not traditional.
Mm.
And I know there are reasons why it's often done when the baby is quite small, because it's seen that the the baby, will heal quicker, and it will
Right.
be less painful. This is the understanding, whether it's scientifically accurate or not, but the understanding. I think it's probably similar within the Jewish community as well, because of course the tradition that we have, and the reason why people do this is it's a tradition that Abraham did, but
Yeah.
Abraham did it when he was about 80 odd years old.
Yeah, that's right.
And now, I mean, if someone in their 80s, chooses to do something like that, I mean,
By all means.
they are certainly a grown adult and can make that decision for themselves.
Yeah.
Um, but it's like, obviously, I mean, we've improved children's rights over the years because there's been all sorts of manner of abuses of children,
Yeah.
which we're aware of now, which historically people didn't really consider or think about. And thank goodness for that. And I mean, in light of all of that, I mean, it raises the question about this as well, because although there's a lot of Jewish and Muslim people that they've been circumcised when they were children, and for a
Yeah.
lot of them, it's not an issue. And even
Yeah.
other people, a lot of Americans get circumcised. I think people in the royal family do as well. And
Yes.
for a lot of them, it doesn't create an issue, and they don't think about it.
Yeah.
But there is a portion of people within these communities that they do complain about it later on in life. Um, and those complaints vary from wondering whether they are missing out on something,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
when they're in a relationship, or, they get married, and whether they actually miss out on something there it feels different or something, and they won't ever know
Yeah.
because they've never experienced that without being circumcised, but not necessarily causing more problems than that, just the curiosity and concern. And then there are other people that they actually complain about, it being painful down there, and
Hmm.
having other issues.
Yeah.
And then there are the horror stories, as you mentioned earlier, where, things have gone terribly wrong and it's actually damaged, and it's very obviously damaged, their genitalia.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, there's a whole spectrum of these complaints that some people within these communities, they mention, and we shouldn't ignore that just because it's fine for maybe even the majority. We shouldn't ignore that. It's still a significant numbers of people that are coming forward with these concerns and these issues. Um, just to make the viewers aware, and these are real. This is not just people gaslighting or making stuff up. These are real documented situations and cases.
Yeah, I mean, Paul, you've you've articulated the case extremely well there. I would entirely echo everything you've said. Maybe I can just pick up on a few of the points you raised.
Please do, yeah.
So I guess maybe this first question of, is it better to do it when on a baby or a child
Mm.
when they're younger because it might heal quicker, or well, I guess just like turning back to what the Royal College of Anaesthetists say, um, we do know that children are capable of experiencing pain during circumcision. And I guess just in terms of the number of deaths, I'm not aware of any adults who have died in the UK following a religious or cultural circumcision, but we do know that there are deaths amongst these babies. And I suppose this idea that, the child won't remember, it's potentially like quite a dark line of reasoning, isn't it? That, if someone doesn't remember something that was done to them, it's therefore okay to do it. That would potentially open up, a justification for all.
And it's very speculative because
Yeah,
how do we know? And I'm sure if we interviewed enough people who had been circumcised, there are going to be at least some that have memories of it.
yeah, and
But it's you can't guarantee that one way or the other.
yeah, you might not have the words to articulate it, but you might nonetheless have a memory in a sort of somatic
Also,
sense.
our understanding of childhood trauma
Yeah,
has considerably increased over the past several decades than what it was previously. But it was pretty much non-existent,
yeah,
before that. And now we know that people, they do experience traumas within childhood, even if they can't remember specifically what it was, and then that can affect them later on in life.
right.
Um,
And
we're
you,
still investigating these areas, but there is real evidence of this now, and historically there wasn't. So of course, historically people can act upon that because they didn't know about it,
yeah,
and it's a speculation that they wouldn't remember, but we
yeah.
don't really know, do we? I mean, until like obviously this more recent research.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, people feeling that they've missed out on, a sort of potentially important erogenous tissue,
Mm,
right? I think that's absolutely right. And if you go on the NHS website, it says circumcision usually leads to loss of sensitivity of the head of the penis, which may be noticeable during sex.
mm,
So yeah, I think you're absolutely right to point that out. And yeah, as you say, those who have been circumcised as a child will never know what the alternative would have been. So this is the removal of a healthy, functional erogenous tissue. Um,
mm.
and then, yeah, also, as you say,
And of course,
many,
people point to cases where you know there are medical reasons for circumcision. There are cases sometimes where it does need to be done for medical reasons, isn't
that
there?
is true. That
That
is
doesn't
true.
mean that that applies to absolutely every individual.
No, no, far from it. So yeah, as you say, there are therapeutic circumcisions, which are those which are required for a pressing medical reason. They are rare. So the only absolute indication for a therapeutic circumcision in a baby would be something called pathological phimosis, which is where the foreskin can't be retracted due to scarring or infection.
Mm.
Um, and so yeah, when there's a pressing medical need,
Now,
of course,
I
that
do actually know someone
right,
who they had that.
yeah,
They're Christian actually, and
right,
for this reason, they did actually have to have an operation. I didn't realize what it was. That they actually had that later on in life.
yeah,
It was because I didn't realize what it was, and for some reason, it wasn't identified earlier
yeah,
on.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so of course those circumcisions are, entirely justifiable, although you should always, explore less invasive measures first.
mm,
So in some cases of phimosis, steroid creams or stretching exercise, or
mm,
less invasive forms of surgery, like a proputioplasty should be explored before going to the most radical and irreversible option, which is, full circumcision. Um, but yeah, and then as you mentioned, many men will be either happy or indifferent that they were circumcised as a child, but there is a small but significant minority of men who feel, one, that their bodily autonomy has been violated,
mm,
or two, that their parents have surgically and irreversibly inscribed their religious beliefs upon the genitals of a non-consenting child. And I mean, perhaps I could just read you, as you say, there are men who are sort of speaking out about this, and maybe I could just
I
read
know
you the
because
two.
I've listened to some cases myself, but please do.
Yeah, I just have some two short quotes from men who were circumcised for Jewish reasons. And one of them writes, "For me, the greatest impact has been psychological. There's a deep sense of betrayal that comes from realizing that people meant to protect you authorized an irreversible harm." And that was a case where nothing sort of went wrong in a sense, right? It was a competently performed circumcision by a medical professional. But I think it shows that even in those cases, there can be harm for some people. And then another man whose parents were Jewish, who featured on a 2019 BBC documentary called "A Cut Too Far." So his circumcision was botched, and it was performed by someone who was not medically qualified. And he said the circumcision left him suicidal and estranged from his parents for 8 years. He said, "It's a great personal issue. It's the most intimate part of someone's body, which makes it even worse that someone would interfere with that.
Mm.
No one should do anything to someone else's body without their consent, full stop, religious or not religious." Um,
And of course, this is where the debate comes as to
yeah,
whether this should be allowed until at least the child is a teenager of a certain age that they can make that decision for themselves.
yeah,
Um, because that avoids that issue if that's allowed. And I mean, especially if they're allowed till they're 18 and they do it.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, every time you circumcise a child, you're rolling the dice, right, on whether they will happen to grow up to share their parents' religious beliefs and happen to be happy that they were circumcised. But if you wait, as you say, and you can
And it seems
ascertain,
we're also rolling the dice as to whether they live and go right,
yes,
which is the
absolutely.
matter. And I mean, no matter any kind of medical procedure, even necessary ones,
Yeah.
there's always potential risk involved.
Yeah.
And this is why normally, I mean, if you go to the doctors to have a medical procedure, even a small one, I mean, it could
Yeah.
be as simple as removing a mole. There are
Yeah.
risks involved. It could get infected. Something else can happen. Now, in the vast majority of cases, of course, that doesn't happen. Or even if it does, there are things that, if they're done quickly, would resolve the matter. But it doesn't mean that any kind of medical procedure is risk-free.
No,
And
far from it.
that obviously includes circumcision. And I mean, if the parents make the decision, then the parents are deciding that themselves, and not the child has no say in it.
Yeah.
So I mean, there is a valid ethical concern and argument here.
Yeah.
Whether people agree with it or whether people think this is sanctioned by God and it must be done,
Yeah.
which I know a lot of people believe in at least these two faiths.
Yeah.
But still, it's a decision that is made, and it is a procedure that is performed, and there is an ethical argument around this.
Yeah, as you say, surgeries are inherently risky, and that's usually within medical practice, surgeries are sort of performed as a last resort, right? You try conservative options first, you try medication first before.
Well, even the point I mentioned about a mole or something as
Yeah,
small as that, they will try and give you some cream or something first to see if it will go away, and resolve itself in that way and dry off, and rather than actually cutting it. Uh,
yeah, and
Cutting is normally something which is reserved as a last option for many
absolutely.
procedures. Yeah.
And we've sent freedom of information requests to the medical regulator, the General Medical Council, which regulates doctors, and we've asked, what sort of complaints have you had from patients or parents related to circumcisions? And in 2024, we found that one child was left with a mutilated penis, and one child almost died during the procedure. So, yeah, as you say, even when performed by a regulated healthcare professional, there are still risks.
And that risk it's not a small thing. I mean,
Yeah,
it's like at the end of the day, if your a man's penis is mutilated, that man can never lead a normal life and have a normal relationship, um, or reproduce even. It's which is something which we all have. It's a part of a biological imperative of living.
yeah,
For the vast majority of people, unless they choose not to, they should at least have that option. Um, so that is deeply, deeply concerning that it can go that badly wrong.
yeah. Yeah, which is why we think this decision should wait until the individual, is capable of making an informed decision where they understand the risks and they can decide for themselves whether they're willing to accept them.
Which is actually quite a you're not calling for it to be completely banned.
No,
Um,
just to be deferred. In the same way that lots of decisions are deferred. I'll just give you a really simple one, like tattooing, right? That's a semi-irreversible body modification, right? And in the UK, it's
it's
illegal.
interesting you use that example because although in the UK it's often used purely for decorative purposes,
Yeah,
but there are actually some communities in the world where it actually has a sacred kind of meaning to it, and some kinds of tattooing are performed as parts of religious rituals as well, and community rituals within
yeah,
certain communities. So
yeah. No, it's interesting, but
it's a very valid comparison.
yeah, and I suppose so under UK law, under the Tattooing of the Minors Act, 1969, I believe, that would be illegal. And it would have to wait until the individual was 18. And I think so, just within the human rights framework, so the European Convention of Human Rights enshrines the right to freedom of religion or belief. That's Article 9. And so your right to hold any belief is absolute. No one is entitled to interfere with that. But your entitlement to manifest that belief. So, for example, tattooing a child because of your cultural or religious beliefs, or circumcising a child because of your cultural or religious beliefs, that's a qualified right, which means that it can be abridged to protect the rights and freedoms of others. And I think too often in the conversation around circumcision, there are two parties here, right? There are the parents with their rights to manifest their religious beliefs, but there's also the child with their independent rights of, well, a right to life, a right to bodily autonomy, a right to freedom of religion or belief, a right to protection from harmful traditional practices. And I think too often the rights of the child are forgotten in this conversation.
No, and they shouldn't be.
Yeah,
You're right to highlight that, and whatever people decide and whatever people think on this, there's definitely a conversation to be had here, and there are definitely ethical considerations
yeah,
that need to be considered and should be considered, as well as potential medical risks that need to
absolutely.
be considered. And at the very least, it should be performed by a medical professional who can at least limit those and make sure that they're on call and they know what they're doing should things go wrong. Whereas, I mean, if someone is just a layman in the street and they're trained by a charity to perform a circumcision without anesthetic, and they don't then know what to do should anything go wrong. I
Yeah,
mean, sure, they'll call an ambulance or something, or we'd hope they would, should that happen. But it's going to take time before the ambulance gets there, and that those valuable minutes could be the time that something could be done. But if a person knew what they were doing, that could actually save that child, even save the child's life. I mean, it can be that serious,
yeah,
and we shouldn't forget that.
absolutely. I mean, in the last two deaths, those were deaths from sepsis,
Mm.
which, it's unclear exactly how the infection was acquired. So, I mean, I guess it's really interesting. In the five deaths that we've had since 2007, there's only been one criminal prosecution. Um, so it does, when surgical interventions are resulting in the deaths of children, uh,
Mm.
there needs to be accountability. Um,
Well,
and
if you think if it was anything else, I mean, if this was happening at a hospital and people were dying or children
yeah,
were dying,
yeah,
there would be public outcry.
yeah,
There'd be investigations. So you would expect the same in this situation, and not for it just to be brushed aside.
definitely.
And look, I'm a Muslim. I have a religious belief myself.
Yeah, of course.
And I believe that people should be allowed to be circumcised if they want to be circumcised. Men, of course. I mean, not. I mean, there's something called FGM as well,
Mm,
which it regards women, and this is something that, generally speaking, Muslim scholars, both in this country and around the world, absolutely reject. I mean, we put out a fatwa in 2013 against that, which was drawn up by a Sunni and a Shia scholar.
right.
And the OIC has also done work in this area. So, but even then, I mean, even with those fatwas in place, so this is like unanimously, or pretty much unanimously, uh, condemned by
Mm,
Islamic scholars around the world. But there are still a lot of Muslims in different communities, and also others, because it's not just a Muslim issue, that practice female genital mutilation. So
yeah,
even in spite of the fatwas, some communities still feel they need to do that, even though they're religious scholars and religious leaders. In many cases, are telling them that that's not part of Islam and they shouldn't be doing it. Um, so, I mean, even when you get religious scholarship that intervenes in this, sometimes these people within these communities, so they've got these ingrained practices still continue them the way they did. I think probably some of the problems we've got with male circumcision are in this area, rather than, yes, having male circumcision, but at least bringing it up to 21st century standards and
mm,
medical practices and considering ethical considerations we should be considering now, which is a duty upon us as Muslims. And I'm sure rabbis would say the same thing.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you bring up FGM. There's a case in the family division of the High Court in 2015 called Re B and G, and it
Mm,
was a care proceeding, so a decision about whether these two children should be taken into care because they were unsafe with their parents. And it all stemmed from the fact that this little girl uh, a scar near her clitoris was identified, and there was some suspicion about whether she had been subjected to a form of FGM called clitoral nicking, which is where, a sort of pin or a needle pricks the clitoris to extract a single drop of blood. Um, and the judge also asked questions about the boy in this family. I believe it was a Muslim family. And he asked, you know, if we were going to take this little girl into care on the basis that she had been subjected to this form of genital cutting, what about the boy who might be subjected to male circumcision? Um, and what he ruled was that actually both of those practices constituted significant harm under the Children Act, 1989, and that male circumcision was actually more invasive than this form of FGM. But because we as a society are willing to tolerate circumcision on a religious basis, that would not be grounds to bring the boy into care. But if it were true that the girl had been subjected to this form of FGM, that would be.
Yeah, it's I know there is a case of social conditioning here, and what people consider normal and what people don't. No doubt with that.
Yeah.
And I mean, as hopefully intelligent people, with access to modern knowledge, medical knowledge, ethical understandings, and things like this, we should be able to make more informed decisions and come up with policies that are suitable for the times in which we live and which benefit people, which is ultimately the whole point of the discussion. It's about safety of children and even of adults. I mean, you wouldn't want adults circumcised by people who are not qualified as well. This is also an issue. I mean, we've mostly been discussing children, but I mean,
Yeah.
um, this is a medical procedure, and it should be performed by someone who has a qualification and a license to perform it, at the very, very least.
Yeah.
I don't think. I mean, the debate about whether this is done in childhood or whether it's done, whether it's allowed to wait until they're older. I don't think that's something that is going to be resolved anytime soon. But
Nor I.
I am aware that both within the Jewish and the Muslim communities, this is something that is cause of ongoing discussions and debates, and there are those in both camps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very powerful opinion piece in The Telegraph from 2012 by Jake Wallace Simons, who you'll know is the former editor of the Jewish Chronicle. And he writes very movingly about his decision not to circumcise his son during childhood, and instead to wait until his son was old enough to decide for himself. And he talks about the medical risks, but he also talks sort of more fundamentally about giving his son the freedom to choose for himself. And he goes back to the story in the Bible of, the binding of Isaac. And he said he would have looked God in the eye and refused. And it's very powerful, and I would really recommend anyone listening
I
to
think that this is
to
another
read.
thing. I mean, I've discussed this situation with the binding of Isaac, or is of course Ishmael within, or for the most Muslims, they regard it was Ishmael, but whichever son it was. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the story aside from that is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things that when you read that as a modern person, you don't understand the context in which it's written, because it sounds completely crazy. What father would do that? But after some years of study, reflection, and research myself, I think the reason being was because child sacrifice was something that was very common between 5,000-6,000 years ago in the Middle East. This is something which completely boggles any sane, rational person today, because what parent would consider doing that? Unless there's something wrong with the parent, no parent's going to, think of anything like that. Quite the opposite. But of course, I mean, there was this kind of system, And it was literally a system in place where it was routine to sacrifice children because people thought they had to sacrifice them to Molech or some other
Yeah.
deity in order that the society wouldn't suffer some catastrophic famine or some other disaster. And I believe this story in Genesis, again, at the very beginning of the Bible with Abraham, is there because, yes, the child was taken to be sacrificed, but then there's that narrative that the angel comes and says, Abraham, God would never, never expect this of you. This is completely wrong. Go sacrifice a sheep or something. Don't sacrifice your son.
Yeah.
And it's like, again, people wonder why there's sheep sacrifice within Judaism, and also we still have Kobani within Islam.
Mm.
In the East, that people sacrifice a sheep, although now that meat is now given to poor people, and it's a form of charity,
Right.
and feeding the hungry, and it's been changed into that. But the actual initial thing of sacrificing a sheep or a goat, it came as a replacement for child sacrifice. I mean, we're talking about things that are ancient beliefs and rituals that go back thousands of years.
Yeah.
And without understanding the context, it's just totally bizarre to us in 2026 when we discuss these things. But when we understand that story was probably there in order to prevent child sacrifice, you suddenly see it wasn't there because it was to create a narrative of child cruelty. It
Yeah.
was actually there to save children from being killed, which is a very humanizing thing. And it was not there because it was anti-human. It was there because it was pro-human and
Yeah.
pro-life. Um,
No, it's really interesting you bring that up because I think some anthropologists have speculated that circumcision may have sort of originated as a practice, as a sort of mitigated form of child sacrifice, right? Instead of the entire child, it's, this part of their body.
and certainly, I mean, a foreskin rather than the death of the child is
Well,
definitely preferable.
yeah,
Yeah, but it's still, I mean, we're not living several thousand years
yeah.
ago,
Maybe we can go one
and
step further.
yeah, so I mean, we really should consider how we practice these things in 2026,
Yeah,
if at all. And if we do practice them, we should practice them with the highest ethical and medical standards that we have available today. And there is precedence within Jewish and Muslim tradition for us to do that.
mm,
And it doesn't undermine our belief. I mean, I think it's a misconception that many people have. A person is, and even Rabbi Romain, when he was asked this at a debate that I attended,
mm,
and someone in the audience asked, "Can you be Jewish if you're not circumcised?"
yeah,
And he said, "Well, I don't ask my congregation whether they are circumcised or not. I've never done that.
yeah,
And as a Muslim chaplain, I never do either. Why would I do that? It doesn't make
right,
sense."
yeah,
And for someone to become a Muslim, all they have to do is declare the kalima shahada, that they believe that there's no God except God and Muhammad is the messenger of God. Anyone who makes that declaration or holds that belief in their heart is a Muslim,
yeah,
whether or not they are circumcised. Um, that doesn't mean that circumcision isn't like an important tradition or sunnah for men within Islam. But at the same time, if they don't do it, it doesn't mean that they're not a Muslim.
yeah.
And that is, something a lot of people I think are not aware of.
Yeah, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, my understanding of Jewish theology is that it's, matrilineal inheritance that makes one Jewish, not your circumcision status.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
that's true for the majority of like normal Jewish communities.
yeah,
That's usually the case. Yeah.
yeah. Wow. Fascinating conversation, Paul. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
And likewise, yeah, really really good to hear from you, Alejandro, and also the work of the National Secular Society, and the fact that you're not trying to make us all atheists or abandon our religions as well. This is reassuring. I mean,
Good. I'm glad.
on that, I mean, do you think? I mean, from your perspective as the
Mm.
National Secular Society, do you think that religious freedoms are becoming stronger or weaker in the United Kingdom?
That's a good question. Let's pick out some recent examples. So Northern Ireland, their legislature has just voted to abolish blasphemy laws, which were still on the books there. So that,
Really? They still have that in Northern Ireland?
yeah, they still had common law offensive blasphemy
Wow.
and blasphemous libel. So all being well, that will be finalized in October. So that would certainly be an improvement, I think, in terms of
I'm
freedom of
shocked that they
expression.
were still in place anywhere in the UK. I missed that one.
Yeah, so they were in place in England and Wales until 2008 and Scotland until 2021. So, yeah, the Northern Ireland was the last one. What else? I suppose in the Isle of Man, if you want to count that, I know it's a crown dependency rather than part of the UK, but they have just voted to end the automatic voting rights of the bishop who sits in their parliament, Tynwald. So there are certainly improvements to point to, but that's not to say that there aren't any threats. So I think there have been instances of sort of what we would describe as de facto blasphemy laws being induced or invoked rather in cases like the teacher at Batley Grammar, which you may be familiar with. There was this case of this film being pulled called Lady of Heaven back in 2022 on religious grounds. There was a child who was subjected to death threats in Yorkshire at Kettlethorpe School after they accidentally scuffed a copy of the Quran. So, there is progress, but we also need to be vigilant of threats as well.
Like, would you say that Britain is becoming more tolerant or less tolerant in these areas?
That's a good question. I guess there's like the legal framework, which is one question where I said arguably progress is being made. But then there's, I don't know, societal attitudes. It does seem like social cohesion is fraying recently that, you know, um,
Tensions
interfaith
seem to be
relations
rising.
are, yeah, are struggling. There are increased rates of, anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate crimes. So there's plenty of work still to be done.
Well, really wonderful talking to you, Alejandro, and thank you for joining us today. And really, appreciate your time and for joining us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Please keep up your good work, looking out for the well-being of all of us and social cohesion. This is certainly something that is rewarding and good work, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. All right, take care.